Dvorak's friendship with Brahms was to ripen and increase with the years. Brahms could not do enough for Dvorak, who naturally practically worshipped the older man. In later years, Brahms was even to read proofs of music for Dvorak when he was away in the United States for a long time. It was a friendship that Brahms gave to few people. Dvorak was now able to give up his post as organist and concentrate more and more on composition. One of his new works was a symphony in F major, and there were quartets, a Stabat Mater, and a piano concerto. He had some success with one of his operas, The Peasant Rogue, in 1878. But his eldest daughter, Anna, died, and that affected his composing immensely for a while. He was writing again, a quartet in D major dedicated to his noble master Johannes Brahms. But he was now 36 and began to take stock of himself. He had composed by this time 8 quartets, 5 operas, 5 symphonies, and a great deal of other works, to say nothing of what he had burned, and a great deal of it was yet to be performed. But times were changing. He sent to Simrock, at the publisher's suggestion, a set of 8 Slavonic dances. Originally scored for 2 pianos, Dvorak very quickly had to orchestrate them, for they proved enormously successful, and Simrock was delighted, paying the composer 300 marks. Now Dvorak's name became famous, not only in his native country, but in Germany, England, and indeed everywhere. If you could play the piano, you played the Slavonic dances. He became acquainted with the great Hungarian violinist Joseph Joachim, who became a firm friend and gave the premiere of many of Dvorak's best chamber works. In 1878, he visited Brahms for the first time, and of course the 2 great composers got along together famously. He was still teaching, but his pupils were the best that Bohemia had to offer. Among them were the composer, Josef Suk, who was to marry Dvorak's daughter, and Leos Janáček, who was to become a very famous composer. Simrock was always asking Dvorak for new pieces to publish, so that money was by now hardly a problem. But the publisher began to annoy Dvorak with his constant demands for little waltzes, dances, and songs, and begging him to stay away from all those quartets, symphonies, and operas. Dvorak let Simrock know that while he would write the little pieces occasionally, he was not a composer of little pieces and would compose what he liked. And if Simrock didn't want the big pieces, well, then he'd send them to another publisher. And that is exactly what he did sometimes. After working on some of those big pieces, such as the violin concerto, the gypsy songs, and quartet in E-flat, Dvorak took a holiday at his brother-in-law's estate in Wysoka, 'a place that Dvorak dearly loved. By now, it was not only little Dvorak that was being performed abroad, but big Dvorak. Hans Richter, the fine Hungarian conductor, presented both in Germany and in England Dvorak's new Symphony in D major, which was highly acclaimed. He was, in fact, greatly in demand as a composer and could hardly perform all of the commissions he received. He once wrote to a friend, "I see in the papers that on December 15th, Helmsberger is to perform my new quartet, which does not yet exist. There is nothing left for me to do but compose it." It was in 1882 that Dvorak's mother died. It was only in work that the composer could lose his sorrow. He worked on his new Symphony in D minor and on his delightful Scherzo Capriccioso. '84 was to see his first visit to London, where he was received as a conquering hero, so great was his fame now. His Stabat Mater was a huge success, and he was asked to compose another choral work with a promise of £2,000 payment, really a princely sum. On his return to Bohemia, he bought a little cottage in the country near his brother-in-law's estate in Vysoka. He had always wanted a home in the country, where he could raise pigeons and walk around the country talking to the peasants, whom he knew and loved because he was one of them. But he was becoming a better businessman, too. He wrote to Simrock that he could no longer accept small amounts for his work, and if Simrock didn't want to pay, well, actually orchestras as well as publishers fought for the right to perform anything that Dvorak wrote. One of his best symphonies dates from these happy times. It is the Symphony No. 8 in G major, and these are its closing moments. He was to be rewarded by the Emperor of Austria for his services to music and received the professorship of the Prague Conservatory of Music, of which Dvorak's old organ school was now a part. His pupils all loved the great composer, and once one wrote that, along with a few prize pupils, he was out walking with Dvorak when it began to rain. Dvorak seemed completely unaware of it, although he was soaked, because he was talking about music. Suddenly, he looked up and said, "Now, children, run along home at once. I think it has begun to rain." During all of his success, he never forgot his country. He received a very tempting offer to settle in Vienna. He refused. He received another to compose an opera in German. He refused. No, Bohemia was his home, and here he would compose. But he kept on receiving very tempting offers from a certain Mrs. Jeanette M. Thurber, the wife of a wealthy grocer in New York. Mrs. Thurber wanted Dvorak to come to America and head her newly formed National Conservatory of Music. Finally, Dvorak said yes. After all, it wasn't permanent, and the salary was $15,000 a year, with 4 months' vacation and not too much to do. Dvorak, by the way, spoke excellent English. He set sail for the United States in 1892, accompanied by most of his children, his darling Anna, and a secretary assistant, Joseph Dvorak. His success in New York was hardly less than it had been in Europe, and Dvorak learned many new things. For instance, through a Negro singer, Thacker Burley, he got to know a number of Negro spirituals. He wrote that, "In the Negro melodies of America, I find all that is needed for a great and noble school of music." He got to know New York very well during the 3 years he was to spend in America. He was living in a little brownstone house that is still standing on East 17th Street. Whenever he could, which was often, he would stroll through Central Park or go down to the railway station, for one of his passions besides music were trains. Or he would walk down to the docks and visit the steamships sailing to the far corners of the world. And he was working on a new symphony. It would be number 9 in E minor and have a title, From the New World. Summertime came at last, and Dvorak was thinking of going back to his home, which he missed greatly, when his assistant, Dvorak, suggested a trip to Spillville, Iowa for the summer. Spillville was settled entirely by fellow Bohemians. It was peaceful and quiet, which appealed to Dvorak, so off they went in one of the composer's favorite trains. He found that Spillville was everything he wanted to help him relax and compose. It was here that the New World Symphony was finished, and here that he was to write his great Quartet in F Major, the American, in only 15 days. Here, too, he wrote what was to become perhaps his best-known piece, the Humoresque, originally part of a set and written for piano, but since transcribed into hundreds of forms. He visited many other parts of America, and at Minnehaha Falls, he was so moved by the beauty of the scene that he took a pencil and wrote, on the cuff of his shirt, the first theme for his sonatine for violin. Back in New York, he attended the premiere of the new symphony, given by the New York Philharmonic, conducted by Anton Seidel. It was an immediate and huge success. What a contrast to the days when he could not even get a piano piece performed. Then it was back to Wysoka for a while, where he received a tumultuous reception. He returned to his little cottage and spent his days resting. He would rise early, take a good walk, attend Mass at 6 o'clock, where he often played the organ, have a hearty breakfast, and so to work. His evenings would be spent at the local inn, talking about America, or playing cards with his friends. It was a good life. Simrock had been giving him troubles, but nothing Dvorak could not handle by now. For instance, he insisted that his fee should be even bigger, and Simrock was forced to pay the famous man for a second set of Slavonic dances, not the 300 marks that he had for the first set, but 3,000 marks. Then Dvorak insisted that the titles on his new pieces be printed in Czech as well as German. Shortly before he returned to the United States, he gave his church a surprise, a new organ. A new organ from a man who hardly 20 years before could not compose because he lacked a piano. It was again in America that he composed his cello concerto in B minor. Johannes Brahms, as ever Dvorak's great friend, remarked when he saw the score, "Why didn't anyone ever tell me you could write a cello concerto like this?" After returning home to Bohemia, Dvorak was tired and not too well. But 2 quartets came from his pen, as well as several operas and other music. He attended a performance of the Symphony from the New World with Brahms in Vienna, where it met with great acclaim. Then in 1896, he was thinking about some new works, including a number of tone poems modeled on Liszt. On April 3rd, 1897, Johannes Brahms died, and the shock to Dvorak can well be imagined. He felt that Brahms had been his guiding light, and that this light was now extinguished. Dvorak was to replace Brahms on the Austrian State Commission that had awarded him his prize so many years ago. He was working on an opera that was to be his greatest, Rusalka. The Austrian state made him a member of their House of Lords, and Prague made him the director of the conservatory in 1901. Then there was what Dvorak described as a fuss over his 60th birthday. The people stood in the streets yelling at the top of their lungs, "Long live Dvorak," while the composer, with tears in his eyes, tried to stop the noise. But his health was not good, and while he worked on one last opera, Armide, he was stricken by illness. On a beautiful May 1st afternoon, he suffered a stroke and died in Prague, among his friends and in his native land that meant so much to him.